air in St. Mary Mead had grown thick with the heavy scent of rain, but it was not the storm that had unsettled the village. The wind howled through the branches of the ancient willow tree, its gnarled limbs stretching like twisted hands over the small, unassuming house that sat at its base. Inside, the pleasant warmth of the fireplace contrasted sharply with the chilly unease that seemed to have taken root in every corner of the room. It was a place that, until now, had been nothing more than a quiet, picturesque home. That evening, Inspector Davies stood by the fireplace trying to make sense of the scene before him. The room had been locked from the inside, as had the house, with no signs of forced entry. The body of Mr. Percival Brackwell, a retired naval officer known for his solitary nature, lay slumped on the floor, his face pale, lips blue, his hand clutched in a tight fist. The strangest thing, though, was the item he held so desperately, an odd piece of paper, folded into a tight square, stained with blood and an unknown substance. Whatever had killed him had not been visible. No wounds, no signs of violence, just the cold, unnerving stillness of death. How did he die? The inspector muttered to himself. But no answers came from the lifeless form that had once been Mr. Brackwell. Mrs. Molesworth, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway wringing her hands. "I don't understand it, Inspector." The door was locked from the inside, as was the window. I went out to fetch the milk just an hour ago, and when I returned, I found him like this. Like he had been, like he had been trapped. She trailed off, and Davies could see her eyes flicker towards the shadow of the willow tree outside, as though it might hold the answers. It was a strange place for such a horrific scene to unfold, almost too quiet, too serene. Yet the mystery of it all was in the air, thick with unsaid things. "I'm afraid there's no logical explanation, Mrs. Molesworth. Have you seen anything unusual lately? Anything that might give us a clue?" Davies asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She shook her head slowly, but he noticed her eyes darting towards the paper in the dead man's hand. I don't know what that means, but I do recall Mr. Brackwell had been acting strangely these past few days, muttering to himself about the willow tree. He said there was something lurking under its roots. Davies frowned. The man was evidently disturbed, but how could that explain his death? He could sense that something more was at play here, something beyond the obvious. As he reached for the piece of paper, his fingers brushed against the cold, lifeless hand of the deceased. He hesitated for a moment, then carefully unfolded it. The writing was messy, scrawled hastily in ink that was now smeared with blood. It was a simple sentence: "The tree knows." The words sent a chill down his spine, but they revealed little else. What was the significance of the willow tree? Why would Brackwell, of all people, have written these cryptic words? And why had he died so mysteriously, with no sign of an attacker? Davies felt a sudden compulsion to investigate further. He turned to Mrs. Molesworth. "You said he mentioned the willow tree. Do you think he was afraid of it?" "Afraid? No," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But I've heard rumors. Strange things have happened around that tree over the years. No one speaks of it openly, but there's always been talk of things. Things that don't belong, things that go bump in the night." Her words were unnerving, but Davies had learned over the years not to dismiss superstition outright. After all, many of the greatest mysteries had been born from the shadows of the inexplicable. "I'll need to speak with the locals," he decided. But I must also check the grounds around the tree. It could be crucial. As Davies made his way outside, the sky darkened, and the wind picked up, carrying with it a deep, unsettling howl. The willow tree loomed before him, its branches swaying as though alive. It looked ordinary enough, yet something about it felt wrong, as though it held a secret, one that was eager to stay hidden. He circled the base of the tree, his boots sinking into the damp earth, and soon found what he was looking for. Half buried, under a tangle of roots, a small wooden box lay hidden. It was worn, ancient, its edges smoothed by time. Slowly, he pried it free, brushing away the soil that clung to it. There was no inscription, no markings, just a plain box. Inside there was a small vial of what appeared to be some kind of dark liquid. The smell was foul, like old decay, and beside the vial, a slip of paper, this one in a different handwriting, read, "The end is near." What was the connection between the vial, the paper, and Mr. Brackwell's death? And what was the meaning of the cryptic messages? These questions weighed heavily on Davies as he retraced his steps back to the house. He found Mrs. Molesworth sitting in the corner, her hands trembling. "I don't know what to make of it, Inspector. It all seems so unnatural." Before Davies could respond, a soft knock came at the door. He opened it to find an elderly woman standing in the threshold. Her frail frame was cloaked in a heavy shawl, and her eyes shone with an intensity that surprised him. She was familiar to him, though he couldn't place her. "I hear you're looking for answers," she said, her voice low but firm. "And you will find them, but only if you're brave enough to face the truth." "Who are you?" Davies asked, taken aback by her sudden appearance. "I am Miss Marple," she said, and her gaze fell to the paper in his hand. "And I think it's time someone solved the mystery of the willow tree." Davies was momentarily speechless. He had heard of Miss Marple, of course, the sharp-witted amateur detective who had solved more cases than any seasoned investigator. It seemed fate had delivered her right into his path. "Perhaps you'll help me, Miss Marple?" Davies asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the mystery that still lingered like a storm on the horizon. She smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. "I think we'll need to examine the past to solve this crime, Inspector. Let's begin with the tree." As the wind howled outside and the rain began to fall in torrents, the two of them stood side by side, ready to uncover the dark secret that lay hidden beneath the roots of the old willow tree. The rain beat against the windows, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo the ticking of an unseen clock. Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing as she stood by the fire, casting her gaze over the room. Davies, by contrast, had become engrossed in the details of the scene, still trying to unravel the puzzle. He had questioned Mrs. Molesworth again, but her answers were no different from before, nervous, fragmented, and unhelpful. The old housekeeper's anxiety was palpable, but Miss Marple, as always, remained unruffled, her mind working with quiet precision. "I've seen this before," Miss Marple murmured to herself, almost too softly for Davies to hear. He glanced over, his brows furrowing in curiosity. "What is it, Miss Marple?" She didn't respond immediately, her eyes fixed on the far side of the room. There, just beyond the threshold of the door to the adjoining study, lay a small table where Brackwell had kept various trinkets. Among them, something out of place caught Miss Marple's attention. A pair of spectacles, lying carelessly on the edge, slightly askew as though abandoned in haste. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice cool and controlled. Davies stepped forward, his eyes following the line of her gaze. The spectacles were not the first thing he had noticed. He had been too focused on the body, the locked doors, the cryptic messages. But now that Miss Marple had pointed it out, something about the spectacles nagged at him. They were not on the table where they usually sat. In fact, he could swear they were not even meant to be there. He reached for them, picking them up gently between his fingers. "Strange," he muttered. "Mr. Brackwell wore these often, didn't he?" Mrs. Molesworth, who had been standing by the door, visibly flinched at the mention of the spectacles. "Yes, but he wasn't wearing them when I found him," she stammered. "I'm sure of it." Miss Marple's lips parted into a small, knowing smile. "Exactly. That's the first clue we've found that isn't entirely in line with what we've been told. Mr. Brackwell did not simply forget to put them on. No, he placed them here deliberately, or someone did." Davies blinked. "You're suggesting someone moved them?" "Not just moved them," Miss Marple replied, her voice firm. "They were deliberately placed where they shouldn't have been. A careful misplacement, likely intended to mislead. We're not looking at an accident, Inspector. We're looking at something more calculated." A sense of unease crept over Davies. The situation had already been bizarre enough, but now it felt as though the room itself were conspiring against them. He had been so focused on the external, signs of violence, or the lack thereof, that he had overlooked the small details that Miss Marple seemed to notice without effort. This was no random death. No, this was far from simple. He set the spectacles down gently, taking a moment to reconsider everything. Brackwell had been meticulous in life, and it seemed unlikely that he would have left his glasses behind, especially not in such a conspicuous manner. But there was something more pressing now, something that reached into the heart of the mystery. Miss Marple was right. This had been a carefully orchestrated act. But what for, and why? "Let's have a look at the other rooms," Miss Marple suggested, as though reading his thoughts. "I suspect we may find something that ties this all together." They moved into the study next, where Brackwell had spent the majority of his time since his retirement. A neat desk, covered with papers, sat in the centre of the room, but it was what lay on the floor that caught Miss Marple's attention. Near the base of the window, almost hidden beneath a discarded rug, was a small but unmistakable smear of dark liquid. At first glance it could have been dismissed as mere dirt or a spilled drink, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw through the illusion. It was blood, fresh and undisturbed by the rain outside. Yet there were no signs of a wound on Brackwell's body. "Look here, Inspector," she said, crouching down to examine the stain more closely. "This is no accidental spill. Whoever did this was careful. They wiped up the blood from Brackwell's hands, but they left just enough behind to leave a trace." "Which means the killer was in here," Davies murmured, his mind racing. "But why? The door was locked, and we know no one entered. This room, this study, has been untouched by any force." Miss Marple stood up slowly, her face as calm and inscrutable as always. "The clue isn't in the study itself, Inspector. The clue lies in what Brackwell had been doing just before his death." Davies was silent for a moment, trying to follow her line of thought. It wasn't easy. The pieces didn't seem to fit yet. "He must have been preparing for something," he finally suggested. "Maybe he was involved in something that led to his death. Was there anything unusual about his activities recently?" Mrs. Molesworth's face remained tight with anxiety. "I told you, Inspector, he'd been acting strangely, but nothing like that." Her voice faltered, and she glanced over at Miss Marple. "He had been out in the garden, under the willow tree. I didn't know what to make of it, but he kept talking about it, saying he needed to prepare for something." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the window, where the branches of the willow tree could be seen swaying ominously against the darkening sky. "What did he mean by prepare, Mrs. Molesworth?" The housekeeper swallowed hard, wringing her hands together. "He said the tree knew something, that it held a secret. He was always coming back to it, always staring at the tree. I thought it was just nonsense, but now I'm not so sure." For a brief moment, Miss Marple allowed herself a soft, thoughtful smile. "The answer, I believe, is in that very tree." Her tone was gentle, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "There's something important hidden beneath its roots, something Mr. Brackwell uncovered. And I suspect it's no mere superstition." Davies, though puzzled, followed her lead, stepping out into the rain once more. The wind had picked up, sending droplets in sharp, stinging bursts against their faces. Yet it was the shadow of the willow tree that called to them now, its dark form looming like a sentry, guarding whatever secret it held. They stood beneath the tree together, the rain streaming down in sheets, and as they peered into the darkness below its roots, something glinted in the mud, a small, forgotten object, half buried but unmistakable. With a small gesture from Miss Marple, they crouched down to uncover it. It was a key, rusted and old, its shape unusual, nothing like a modern key. "Now," Miss Marple said, holding the key in her hand, "I believe we are beginning to understand." The rain had slowed to a light drizzle as Miss Marple and Inspector Davies stood silently beneath the weeping branches of the willow tree, staring at the rusted key in the detective's hand. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the promise of something hidden, something just out of reach. "This key," Miss Marple said, breaking the silence, "has a peculiar shape, wouldn't you agree, Inspector? It's unlike any I've seen before. And its age. It's as though it has been waiting for years to be found." Davies looked at the key again, his fingers running over its intricate teeth. "A key to a secret, Miss Marple. But where does it lead? And why would Brackwell have hidden it beneath the tree? I suspect Mr. Brackwell knew something dangerous. Perhaps he uncovered whatever the tree was hiding and paid the price for it." Davies glanced at the housekeeper, who had joined them under the tree, her face pale and tense. "Mrs. Molesworth, do you recognize this key? Could it belong to a locked room in the house?" Mrs. Molesworth blinked at the key, her face contorting with confusion. "I've never seen it before, Inspector, but there are places in the house that no one speaks of, rooms that are locked. I'm not sure why, but Mr. Brackwell kept them locked tight. He always said they were private." The mention of hidden, locked rooms stirred something in Davies. He had noticed the strange arrangement of the rooms earlier, the study, the sitting room, the parlour. There was a sense of deliberate order, but it was the type of order that spoke of secrecy. The walls of the house, it seemed, held their own stories, stories that had been kept from prying eyes. "We need to check those rooms," Davies said firmly, his mind racing, "and we need to speak to anyone who might know what Brackwell was involved with. There are too many unanswered questions here." Back inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Mrs. Molesworth seemed on edge, as though she was treading on ground that was no longer solid. She fidgeted as Davies and Miss Marple questioned her again. The housekeeper's nervousness was hard to ignore. There was a flicker in her eyes, a subtle hint of fear that suggested she was hiding something. "I've told you everything I know, Inspector," she said, her voice trembling. He was a private man, always so secretive about certain things. And he'd been speaking of a visitor, someone who came to see him the week before his death. "A visitor?" Davies repeated, his voice sharp. "Who?" Mrs. Molesworth hesitated, her hands wringing the fabric of her apron. "I didn't ask him much, but there was a man, a stranger. He came late in the evening, always after dark. I didn't recognize him, but Mr. Brackwell spoke to him in private. I couldn't hear the conversation, but he seemed upset afterward." "Did this visitor come often?" Miss Marple asked, her gaze fixed on the housekeeper. "No more than twice. But he was the only one. After that, Mr. Brackwell became distant. He wasn't the same. He kept to himself more, spending time under the willow tree and writing." Mrs. Molesworth's voice trailed off, as though the weight of her own words had begun to settle on her. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Writing? What kind of writing?" "I don't know exactly, but it was always late at night, and he'd never let anyone see it. He would burn the pages afterward." "Burn them?" Davies echoed. "That's peculiar. Why would he destroy his own writings?" "That's something I don't understand, Inspector," Mrs. Molesworth replied, her voice low. "But I do know that whatever he was working on, it changed him." Davies exchanged a look with Miss Marple, who remained silent, her expression thoughtful. There were too many contradictions in Mrs. Molesworth's story. On one hand, she seemed willing to share every detail. On the other, there was a sense of hesitation in her words, as though she knew more than she was letting on. "You said Mr. Brackwell spoke of a visitor," Miss Marple interjected. "Do you know anything else about him? Was there anything unusual about this man?" Mrs. Molesworth's gaze darted to the window, as if searching for something just beyond her reach. "He wasn't from around here. He didn't look like anyone I knew. And the way Mr. Brackwell spoke to him, it was like he feared him. I don't know if that means anything, but I've seen that look before. It's the look of someone in trouble." Davies leaned forward, his instincts telling him they were on the brink of something important. "You've seen this look before. Where?" Mrs. Molesworth swallowed hard. I used to work for the Rileys, the old family that lived in the manor down the lane. Mr. Riley, he had dealings with some unsavory people who came to him at night, just like that man did with Mr. Brackwell. I never asked questions, but I saw the fear in their eyes, the kind of fear that makes you do things you wouldn't normally do. That's what Mr. Brackwell had when he spoke to him." A chill crept down Davies's spine. "And these people Mr. Riley dealt with, were they involved in anything illegal?" Mrs. Molesworth's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know. But I always wondered about the old manor. There were rumors about things buried on the property, things that didn't belong." The housekeeper's cryptic words lingered in the air, filling the room with a sense of foreboding. Whatever Mr. Brackwell had uncovered, it was tied to something dark and dangerous. And the visitor, this mysterious man who had been in contact with Brackwell, was a key figure in the puzzle. "We need to find this man," Davies said firmly. "Do you remember anything about him, anything at all?" Mrs. Molesworth shook her head, but Miss Marple's gaze had already turned toward the door, her mind clearly racing through the possible connections. "The visitor," she mused aloud, is important, yes. But I believe the answers lie within the manor, especially if the old rumours hold any truth. We'll need to speak with the neighbours too, Davies added, his thoughts turning to the Rileys. If anyone knew about these dealings, it would be them. As they prepared to leave the house, Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing in thought. One more thing, Inspector. When you spoke to Mrs. Molesworth earlier, did you notice her reaction to the key? Davies's brow furrowed. Her reaction? Miss Marple's eyes flickered knowingly. She's hiding something, Inspector. She may not know exactly what happened to Mr. Brackwell, but she knows more than she's letting on. Davies felt a wave of realization wash over him. Mrs. Molesworth was hiding something crucial. The question now was, what had she seen or heard that she was too afraid to share? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the puzzle was far from complete. There was much more to uncover, and the voices of deception were just starting to rise to the surface. The atmosphere inside the manor was heavy with uncertainty, each creak of the old house seeming to echo the tension that now lingered in the corners of every room. Miss Marple and Inspector Davies stood at the foot of the staircase, their minds whirring as they prepared for the next phase of the investigation. They had no shortage of suspects, each one with their own secrets, their own motives, but none of it made sense when put together. Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear, they all seemed to play a part. But how? Mrs. Molesworth knows more than she's telling, Davies said quietly, his voice laced with frustration. She's hiding something, I can feel it. But what exactly? What does she know that we don't? Miss Marple's keen eyes drifted over the grand staircase, the polished wood reflecting the dim light of the evening. The house has its own secrets, Inspector. Mrs. Molesworth may have been in the position to overhear things, but I believe it is the others who are more directly involved. If we start looking at the bigger picture, at the people around Mr. Brackwell, we might see the tangled web that's been spun. They made their way into the parlour, where the first of the neighbours had arrived, Ms. Eliza Carrington, a woman of middle age with a tightly coiled bun and a demeanour that was as stiff as her posture. She had known Brackwell for years, and though her expression was polite, there was an undeniable wariness in her eyes. She looked less like someone concerned with the death of a friend, and more like someone concerned with her own safety. "Inspector, Miss Marple," she greeted them coolly, her eyes darting between the two. "I understand there's been an unfortunate incident. How can I be of assistance?" Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the way she clasped her hands together tightly, the slight tremor in her fingers. "We'd like to hear about your relationship with Mr. Brackwell, Miss Carrington. Any interactions recently that might help us understand why someone would want to harm him?" Miss Carrington's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Brackwell was a private man, as you probably know. We had our share of disagreements, but nothing I would have thought would lead to something like this. He was very focused on his garden, you know, and that tree. Always that tree." Her voice faltered slightly as she spoke of it. "The willow tree," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but pointed. "Did you know about his recent obsession with it?" Eliza Carrington stiffened. I don't know what you mean. He spent time there, yes, but we all have our hobbies, don't we? Mr. Brackwell was no different." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "but I've heard rumours that he was digging around the base of that tree as though searching for something." Miss Carrington's breath hitched, and she quickly averted her gaze. "I've heard no such thing. I'm afraid I can't help you any further." Davies caught the shift in her demeanour. the nervous twitch in her eyes. Something about her reluctance to discuss the tree seemed significant. "Miss Carrington," he said, his voice steady. "Is there something you're not telling us? Anything at all?" She met his gaze, her expression hardening. "I told you what I know. If you'll excuse me, I have nothing more to add." As Miss Carrington left the room with the same clipped composure she had entered with, Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "She's hiding something, Inspector. That tree has more to do with this than we first thought. But her reluctance tells us that she knows more about it than she's letting on." Davies sighed, rubbing his temple. "Every time we think we have a lead, it seems to go cold. What's going on here? What's the connection between the tree and Brackwell's death?" Miss Marple glanced at the door where Miss Carrington had exited. "It's not just her. The more we learn about Brackwell, the more we see that every person close to him has a reason to be involved. But none of it quite adds up. Let's consider his family next. His niece, Margaret." Davies nodded, pulling a note from his pocket. "I've arranged for her to meet us here shortly. Apparently she had a lot of contact with Brackwell in the weeks leading up to his death." It wasn't long before Margaret Brackwell arrived, her young face flushed from the cold, her eyes downcast as she entered the room. She was the image of sorrow, but Miss Marple had seen such displays before. It was easy to feign grief when it suited one's purposes. "Miss Brackwell," Miss Marple said gently, "I understand this is a difficult time, but we need your help in understanding your uncle's recent activities." Margaret looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, but her voice was steady. "Uncle Reginald, he was my guardian. I was his only family. I spoke to him just days before." Her words trailed off, as though the thought of her uncle's death was too much to bear. He was acting strangely, though. He spoke of something that terrified him. He said he was afraid for his life, that someone was after him. "A man?" Davies asked, his eyes narrowing. "No," Margaret replied, shaking her head. "He never mentioned a name, but he said it wasn't just one person, it was something bigger. He was planning to leave, to go somewhere far away. I thought he was just being paranoid." "Did he mention anything specific that would explain his fear?" Miss Marple pressed. Margaret hesitated. "No, but he made me promise not to tell anyone what he'd been working on. I thought it was just some business matter, something he wanted to handle on his own. But now I wonder if he was being threatened." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Davies. "And did you ever find anything unusual? Anything that could explain his sudden fear?" Margaret swallowed hard, her hands clenched in her lap. "He was always so secretive. But I did find a letter. It was addressed to him, but there was no return address, just a message inside. It said, 'Your secrets will be your undoing.'" Her voice dropped to a whisper as she continued, "I didn't think it meant anything at the time, but now I'm not so sure." The tension in the room thickened. A letter with such a cryptic warning, and now Margaret was telling them about her uncle's growing fear. This wasn't paranoia, it was real. "Where is the letter?" Davies asked, his voice urgent. I burned it," Margaret said, her eyes avoiding their gaze. "I didn't think it was important, but now I regret it." Miss Marple's sharp gaze never wavered. "Why burn it, Miss Brackwell?" Margaret's eyes flickered nervously. I didn't want anyone to find out. Uncle Reginald told me to. He said it was better if no one knew. Miss Marple and Davies exchanged a look. The pieces were starting to come together. There was something much darker at play here. Something that involved more than just the willow tree. Brackwell had been wrapped up in a dangerous secret. And now his niece had destroyed the only piece of evidence that might have explained it. It seemed every suspect had a reason to be involved. The tangled web of deception was only growing more complex, and each new revelation only deepened the mystery. But Miss Marple had learned one thing for certain: the truth, as elusive as it was, could not remain hidden for long. The investigation had taken a sudden turn, and for the first time in days there was a glimmer of hope. After speaking with Margaret Brackwell, Inspector Davies had insisted on searching the house once again, convinced that the letter, even if destroyed, had left behind some trace. They scoured the rooms meticulously, their efforts seeming fruitless, until in the study Miss Marple's sharp eyes had caught something, a scrap of paper buried behind the bookshelf. It was a torn corner, barely noticeable, but unmistakable when combined with the fragments of a letter found in the fireplace. The message was brief, hurriedly written but unmistakable in its implications. I know what you're planning. It's too late for you. The tree will reveal everything. It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The authorities, eager for closure, wasted no time. They contacted the local press and began announcing that they had discovered the identity of the killer. It was the most logical conclusion. Based on the evidence they had pieced together, Brackwell's death seemed connected to the mysterious man from the letter. Someone had wanted to stop him from uncovering a dangerous secret. The case appeared solved. The killer had been unmasked. But Miss Marple was not so easily convinced. She stood at the window of the drawing room, watching as the evening light waned, her thoughts racing. Davies had declared the case closed in front of the press, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together as neatly as they seemed. Brackwell had been a private man, but why had he kept so many of his dealings shrouded in secrecy? Why had his fear, though palpable, been so unwarranted in the eyes of others? And why, if he had been truly terrified, had he not confided more in his family? She was still turning these thoughts over in her mind when Davies entered the room, his face taut with the strain of the day's developments. He looked almost relieved, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, something that mirrored Miss Marple's own unease. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, his voice betraying a hint of exhaustion, "it looks like we've cracked it. All signs point to a clear motive. Brackwell had uncovered something that involved money, power, and greed, and that man, whoever he was, didn't want it getting out." Miss Marple nodded slowly but didn't speak. She couldn't help but notice the change in Davies's tone. The confidence he had shown earlier was giving way to something else, something closer to apprehension. "There's one thing that doesn't sit right," Miss Marple said after a long pause. "The key. The key we found beneath the tree. It's too obvious. It doesn't feel like something that was meant to be uncovered so easily. If the killer was trying to cover their tracks, why leave such a telling clue? It's almost as if they wanted us to find it." Davies's brow furrowed. "You think it's a setup?" "I'm not certain yet, but the more I think about it, the more it doesn't add up. Brackwell's death wasn't a simple crime of passion. It was orchestrated. The clue, the letter, everything points to a carefully calculated act." "Then why the confession?" Davies asked, clearly baffled. Why would someone go to all the trouble of framing themselves? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes sharp. Because it's not about framing themselves. It's about setting the stage for something larger, something we're not seeing yet. Davies sighed, rubbing his temple. He had been so sure that they had cracked the case, so certain that the evidence pointed directly to the truth. But Miss Marple's words lingered in his mind, pushing aside his growing certainty. Perhaps they had missed something. I think it's time we looked at the people closest to Brackwell again, Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. The ones who had the most to gain from his death. Let's not forget that his niece Margaret was the only heir to his estate, the one who stood to inherit everything. Davies paused, clearly reconsidering the path they had taken. But Margaret, she was devastated by his death. She's shown no signs of being involved. No, Miss Marple agreed, but sometimes grief can be a mask. People often hide their motives behind it. I don't think she's the one we should be worried about, though. Not entirely. It's her uncle's dealings that are the key. They spent the next few days questioning everyone who had been close to Brackwell, trying to learn more about his recent activities. It became clear that the man had been tangled in a network of shady business dealings, illegal land purchases, high-risk investments and promises made to unsavory individuals. But there was something else, something deeper. Brackwell had been searching for something that tied back to his own past, to his family's history, to the very land on which the manor stood. It was late one evening when Miss Marple's persistence paid off. The detective was sitting alone in the study, her gaze fixed on an old map of the estate that she had found buried under a pile of dusty papers. It was an old map, dating back to the late 1800s, and it marked areas of the estate that had long been forgotten. Hidden caves, forgotten wells, places that no one ever thought to visit. But the map also bore a peculiar symbol, a symbol that Miss Marple had seen before. A small circular emblem with a willow tree at its center. Her pulse quickened as she leaned closer to the map. She had seen that emblem on the letters Brackwell had burned, the symbol that had been so carelessly discarded, the one that tied everything together. The tree, the willow tree, was not just a place of secrets. It was a symbol of something far more ancient, far more dangerous. With this new piece of the puzzle, the detective returned to the tree that had started it all. They dug deeper beneath its roots, their efforts now fueled by a greater understanding of the importance of this place. They unearthed an old chest, sealed and locked. But inside was the final piece of the puzzle, a collection of letters, documents, and photographs that had been hidden away for generations. But the real shock came when they discovered that one of the photographs was of a young Margaret Brackwell, standing beside a man whose face had been scratched out. The letters detailed a hidden fortune, one that had been passed down through Brackwell's family. It was a fortune that Margaret had been promised, a fortune she could only claim if her uncle was dead. The web of deception had just begun to unravel, and as Davies stood frozen, staring at the contents of the chest, Miss Marple's suspicion had turned to certainty. The false victory they had celebrated was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated lie. The real criminal had remained in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. And now Miss Marple knew that moment had arrived. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit study, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph that had shocked Davies into silence. The photograph of a young Margaret Brackwell beside the man whose face had been scratched out. The image had been carefully hidden within the old chest, but its implications were clear now. The connection was undeniable. Margaret was not just an innocent niece. She was tied to something far deeper than anyone had realized. As Davies continued to scrutinize the letters, Miss Marple's mind drifted back to the small details that had been overlooked. She had always believed that every crime had its roots in the past, and it was in these long-forgotten corners that the truth often hid, waiting to be found. This photograph had unearthed something buried, something from another time. The connection between the photograph and the letters was more than just circumstantial. The man with the scratched-out face, the fortune mentioned in the documents, it was all beginning to make sense. But there was still a piece missing. "I'm going to visit an old acquaintance," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "Something tells me it's time to revisit a case from long ago. The truth is not just in the here and now." Davies looked up, clearly puzzled. "Another case? I don't see how—" "I think you'll see when I return," she interrupted, her eyes already distant with thought. "This is not the first time the Brackwell family has been caught up in a web of deception." She left the manor shortly after, her mind churning with the possibility of what had been uncovered. She didn't head for the police station, nor did she go to speak with any of the remaining suspects. Instead, she made her way to the small village cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was a place most people had long forgotten, but to Miss Marple it held memories of a case from many years before, a case that had never been solved. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and the weight of time. Miss Marple made her way to a weathered tombstone at the far end of the cemetery, one that stood alone in a small, neglected corner. The name on the stone was faint, nearly erased by years of rain and neglect. But Miss Marple knew it well. Edward Brackwell. The name sparked a flicker of recognition in her mind. Edward Brackwell had been the father of Reginald Brackwell, Margaret's grandfather. He had been a man of questionable character, rumoured to have been involved in some shady dealings of his own, land schemes, bribery and more. But he had died young, under mysterious circumstances, a case that had been quickly closed by the authorities as an unfortunate accident. The details had never fully sat right with Miss Marple, and she had never forgotten the nagging feeling that something about his death was being concealed. She bent down, carefully brushing the leaves and moss from the base of the tombstone, and there it was, a faded inscription that read, "To the lost son of Brackwell Manor, may your secrets rest with you." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. The words had always struck her as odd, and now they seemed even more cryptic than before. This was no ordinary tribute. It was a message that hinted at something more, something buried in the past, just like the letter fragments they had found. The key to the current case wasn't just in Brackwell's death. It was in the legacy of the Brackwell family, its ties to old money, its hidden dealings, and the secrets it had fought to keep buried. After a moment of reflection, Miss Marple stood, her mind now working at full speed. It wasn't just the current generation that had secrets to hide, it was the entire Brackwell bloodline. She had seen enough to understand that everything connected, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. Edward Brackwell's death had been no accident, and the fortune he had left behind had been a key that had passed down through the generations, with one goal in mind: keeping the legacy of the Brackwell family intact, no matter the cost. Miss Marple made her way to the local archives, where records of old cases were kept in a dusty, forgotten corner. She searched through the files, her heart pounding as she found what she had been looking for, an old police report detailing the suspicious death of Edward Brackwell. The report was brief, barely a few pages long, but it was enough. Edward Brackwell had died in a fire at Brackwell Manor, the official cause being an unfortunate accident. But the report mentioned something curious. 2 witnesses had claimed to have seen someone fleeing the scene shortly before the fire broke out. A man, described as tall, with dark hair and a thick beard. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she read the description. The witness accounts were vague, but they matched someone she knew from the past. A man who had been involved in Brackwell's shady dealings, none other than Elijah Molesworth. The name sent a jolt through Miss Marple. Molesworth was Mrs. Molesworth's father, the family lawyer who had handled much of the Brackwell estate. He had been a trusted confidant, or so it seemed at the time, but Miss Marple remembered the rumours, the whispers of his involvement in some of Brackwell's more questionable activities, including land acquisitions that bordered on fraudulent. His name had been mentioned in the context of the fire, but it had never been investigated thoroughly. The case had been closed too quickly, swept under the rug as an accident. But now it all made sense. The fire had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate act, designed to cover up the murder of Edward Brackwell. And Elijah Molesworth had been the one to orchestrate it. The hidden connection between the past and present had finally come to light. Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced the story together. Elijah Molesworth had been involved in a deadly game of power and greed long before Reginald Brackwell's death. He had been trying to secure the Brackwell fortune for himself, manipulating everyone around him to get what he wanted. But when Edward Brackwell had died in the fire, the fortune had been passed on to Reginald, and Molesworth had bided his time, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike again. And now, it seemed, that moment had arrived. Miss Marple returned to the manor, her steps quick and purposeful. The pieces were almost all in place, but there was one final confrontation to be had. Elijah Molesworth's involvement in the death of Edward Brackwell had been buried for too long. But now, as the shadows of the past came to light, Miss Marple knew that the truth would finally be uncovered. As she entered the study, she saw Davies standing near the window, staring out at the garden with a pensive expression. He looked up as she approached, his face clouded with uncertainty. "I think we've been looking at this all wrong," Miss Marple said quietly. "The crime isn't just about the present, it's about the past, and it's rooted in a long-forgotten tragedy." Davies raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The true story of Brackwell Manor began long before Reginald's death," she replied. "And the man we've been chasing, he's not a stranger to this family. He's been a part of it for years." The real criminal, Miss Marple knew, had been hiding in plain sight all along. The final pieces of the puzzle were now within reach, but Miss Marple knew that there was still something missing, something that would finally unmask the true criminal. She had considered every angle, examined every clue, but the picture still felt incomplete. There was only one thing left to do, a test, a carefully orchestrated move to provoke a reaction and reveal the hidden truth. As evening descended over Brackwell Manor, Miss Marple prepared herself for the confrontation that would expose everything. She had already sent word to Davies that she would need him at her side, but only for the final stage. The rest of the investigation had already been set in motion. He had been helpful, but now the time had come to move in a direction he would never expect. She met with the suspects one last time in the drawing room. Margaret Brackwell was there, of course still reeling from the shock of her uncle's death. But she wasn't alone. Elijah Molesworth, the family lawyer, had been summoned as well, along with several other key figures, each one a person of interest in the tangled web of deceit. Miss Marple stood in front of them quiet for a moment, her eyes scanning their faces. They all looked tense, nervously glancing at each other, unsure of what would happen next. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes betraying a mix of grief and something else. Something that Miss Marple had seen before. Something she'd learned to recognize in the eyes of those who had something to hide. "Let's get straight to the point," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "We all know the truth is out there, waiting to be uncovered. You've all been living with it for far too long. It's time to stop pretending." She paused, letting her words sink in, watching as the tension in the room thickened. None of the suspects spoke. None of them dared to meet her gaze directly. "I've noticed something," Miss Marple continued, her eyes narrowing as she looked at each one of them in turn. "It's a small thing, almost insignificant, but it's there. And it's enough to tell me that someone in this room isn't being truthful." Elijah Molesworth shifted in his seat, his gaze briefly flicking to Margaret, but he quickly composed himself, folding his hands on the table in front of him. Margaret, on the other hand, met Miss Marple's eyes with an almost pleading expression, as if silently begging her to leave the truth unspoken. Miss Marple smiled faintly, an idea forming in her mind. "I have a theory," she said, her voice soft but laced with purpose. "I believe one of you is trying to manipulate the situation, to guide it in a direction that will exonerate you. But I also believe that someone here, someone, has made a mistake, and that mistake will be the key to unraveling this entire mystery." The room fell silent as Miss Marple let her words settle. She wasn't asking anyone to confess. She wasn't looking for guilt in their eyes. She was looking for something else entirely, a reaction. She was testing them, pushing their boundaries, probing their characters to see who would break under the pressure. It was then that Margaret spoke, her voice trembling, but her words sharp. "What exactly are you implying, Miss Marple?" she asked, the edge in her tone betraying more than just confusion. "That we've all been lying to you? What proof do you have?" Miss Marple's eyes locked onto Margaret's. There it was, the crack, the subtle reveal of unease. Margaret's question wasn't one of disbelief. It was one of defensiveness. She had been backed into a corner, and it was now clear that her earlier attempts to remain distant and grief-stricken were slipping. She was losing control. "I don't need proof, Miss Brackwell," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but unwavering. "Sometimes it's the smallest of reactions that reveal the truth." She glanced toward Molesworth, noting the subtle way his hand tightened into a fist on the armrest. His eyes flicked toward the door, then back at her, the faintest sign of impatience creeping into his demeanor. Miss Marple turned to Davies, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. She gave him a small nod, signaling him to proceed with the next step of her plan. Davies cleared his throat and stood up, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. He produced a small sealed envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the table in front of them. "This is a letter," Davies said, his voice steady. "A letter found in the study, written in Brackwell's hand. It's important to the investigation, and it may contain something that can change everything." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Margaret or Molesworth. She watched their reactions carefully, studying the subtle shifts in their expressions. Margaret's face paled slightly at the mention of the letter, and Molesworth's hand gripped the armrest even harder. The tension was palpable, but it was Molesworth's reaction that Miss Marple was focused on. He was hiding something. Davies slid the envelope across the table, carefully tearing the seal. Inside there was a single sheet of paper, its contents barely legible, but unmistakably familiar. It was the same handwriting Brackwell had used on his final letter, but this time it wasn't a message about the present. It was about the past. It contained a confession, one that tied everything together: the land deals, the secret fortune, the family's twisted history. Miss Marple glanced at Molesworth. His jaw clenched, and his eyes flickered toward the window, his discomfort now fully apparent. "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that this letter was meant for someone specific. It wasn't just a confession. It was a warning. But now it seems to be nothing more than a testament to a long-ago crime. A crime that you, Mr. Molesworth, helped to conceal." Molesworth's face tightened, and he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snapped, his voice far less controlled than before. "This is all conjecture. You're grasping at straws." But Miss Marple didn't flinch. "No, Mr. Molesworth. You're the one grasping at straws. You thought you had buried the past, but the truth always finds its way to the surface. And now you've made a mistake. Your reaction just now, it's enough to prove what I've suspected all along." Molesworth turned to the door, his expression a mixture of fury and panic. He was no longer in control. His deception had cracked, and the truth had finally come to light. Miss Marple turned back to the rest of the room, her gaze unwavering. "It's over," she said simply, watching as Molesworth hesitated at the threshold, realizing there was no way out. The last mask had fallen. The shadows of the past had risen to meet the present, and now there would be no escape from the consequences. The air in the drawing room was thick with tension, the walls seemingly closing in as Miss Marple, Davies, and the remaining suspects stood in the aftermath of the revelation. Molesworth, his face pale and sweating, had turned and fled the room, his departure marked by the hurried click of the door closing behind him. Margaret, her hands shaking, had yet to speak, her wide eyes darting between Miss Marple and the place where Molesworth had been standing just moments before. The room was quiet for a moment, but the silence was laced with the heaviness of something far more sinister, the calm before the storm. Miss Marple could feel the shift, an undercurrent of unease running through the house, as if the walls themselves were closing in to protect the secrets that had long been hidden. "That letter," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper. Was it truly from my uncle?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, Miss Brackwell. It was his handwriting. And it's the final piece of the puzzle, the proof that ties everything together. It wasn't just a confession. It was a warning. Your uncle knew what was coming, and he tried to ensure the truth would come to light." Margaret's expression flickered between relief and sorrow. But now, her voice trailed off, and she turned away, her gaze falling to the floor. Miss Marple's attention had already shifted, her mind working at a faster pace. Molesworth had been too quick to flee, and his panicked reaction was a sign that the walls were closing in on him. He had known that the game was up, but there was one more hurdle to clear. Molesworth had something, a piece of the puzzle, something he could use to turn the tide in his favour, and Miss Marple knew that she had to act swiftly before the situation slipped out of her control. "I need to speak with the staff," Miss Marple said, her tone purposeful. "There's still time, but only just. We cannot afford any more delays." Davies nodded, and together they left the room. The hallway was quiet, the house eerily still as they made their way to the servants' quarters. Miss Marple's mind raced as she formulated her next steps. They had the confession, the truth, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Molesworth would be desperate now, and desperation often led to rash decisions. When they reached the servants' quarters, Miss Marple spoke with the housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Hadley, who seemed somewhat more frazzled than usual. "Have you seen Mr. Molesworth?" Miss Marple asked, her tone measured, her eyes sharp. Mrs. Hadley hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the stairs before answering. "I haven't seen him since he left the drawing room, but he seemed rather upset, quite unlike himself." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see. Thank you, Mrs. Hadley." The housekeeper's nervousness only added to Miss Marple's sense of urgency. She turned to Davies, giving him a silent signal to accompany her as she retraced her steps back toward the study. Something was off. It was too quiet now, too still. As they approached the study, Miss Marple's instincts screamed that something had changed. The door, which had been securely closed moments ago, now stood slightly ajar. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stepped forward, hand trembling as she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was in disarray. The desk had been rifled through, papers scattered on the floor as if someone had been searching for something specific. But that wasn't what caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the empty space on the desk, the spot where the letter had been placed just moments ago. The confession was gone. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting over every inch, searching for any trace of the missing letter. But there was nothing, not a shred of evidence, remained. Someone had been here, and they had taken it. "They've stolen it," Miss Marple murmured, her voice tight with frustration. "The letter is gone." Davies, who had been standing behind her, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. But who would do such a thing? Who knew it was here? Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly, piecing together the possibilities. The theft was too precise, too quick. Whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were looking for. They were aware of the importance of that letter. They were trying to destroy the truth before it could be revealed. "There's only one person who could have done this," Miss Marple said, her voice steady despite the growing sense of urgency. "Molesworth." "But how did he get back in?" Davies asked, his tone rising. "We've been with the others the whole time. No one has left." "Except for Molesworth," Miss Marple interjected. "He left in a panic, but I suspect he's been hiding in plain sight, watching us from the shadows. He must have come back after I left the room to retrieve the letter. And now, he has it. All the pieces are in his hands, and he'll stop at nothing to bury the truth." The situation had escalated far quicker than Miss Marple had anticipated, and the stakes were now higher than ever. She had underestimated the lengths to which Molesworth was willing to go. But the game wasn't over yet. "We must move quickly," Miss Marple said, her voice decisive. "We need to find Molesworth before he has time to destroy the evidence. We need to confront him before it's too late." Davies, looking more determined than ever, nodded. "I'll go round up the others. I'll make sure no one leaves the house." Miss Marple turned back toward the door, her mind already working on her next move. She had a plan, and Molesworth would not escape this time. But the clock was ticking, and with every passing second the chance of uncovering the truth grew slimmer. The letter had been the key, and now it was gone. But as always, Miss Marple knew that no matter how well a criminal tried to cover their tracks, they could never erase every last piece of evidence. And Molesworth, despite his cleverness, would soon learn that Miss Marple had a way of finding the truth, even in the most elusive of shadows. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she moved through the house, her mind racing. Every step seemed heavier than the last, as the quiet of the manor began to weigh on her shoulders. Davies had gone off to search the grounds for any sign of Molesworth, but Miss Marple knew better. Molesworth had planned for every eventuality. The letter, the key to the entire investigation, was now in his hands. He would stop at nothing to make sure it never reached the authorities. The quiet hum of the house felt like a warning, an uneasy stillness that had taken over every corner of Brackwell Manor. The staff had been sent to their quarters. The guests had been gathered in the sitting room, and yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the stolen letter. It was the sudden, inexplicable sense of danger that had crept into her bones. She was about to enter the study again when a sudden, sharp sound echoed down the hall. A cry, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps running frantically. Miss Marple froze, her senses heightened as she moved swiftly toward the source of the noise. It came from the back of the house near the gardens, where the servants' quarters were located. Before she could make it to the door, there was a shout, then silence, and then chaos. The doors flew open, and Mrs. Hadley rushed into the hallway, her face ashen, her eyes wide with terror. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple, you need to come quickly. There's been an attack." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "An attack?" she repeated, trying to remain calm despite the rising panic in her chest. "Who was it? What happened?" "It's Mr. Molesworth. He's been found in the garden. It looks like—" He's been shot!" Mrs. Hadley's voice trembled, her hands wringing together in distress. Miss Marple didn't hesitate. "Take me there," she said, her tone firm despite the shock of the news. "Now!" They rushed through the house, Miss Marple's mind already working to piece together the puzzle. A shooting. Molesworth, the Bawa, very man she had been chasing for the past days, had been shot in the garden. Was it an assassination? A final act of desperation on his part? Or was someone else trying to silence him before he could reveal the truth? When they reached the back of the manor, the garden was a scene of chaos. A small crowd of servants and guests had gathered near the hedges, their faces stricken with disbelief. And in the middle of it all there was Molesworth, still breathing, though pale and trembling. A dark stain spread across his chest, his blood seeping into the earth beneath. "Him! He's still alive," Miss Marple said, her mind already moving to the next step. "But we need to act quickly. Is there anyone with him?" One of the servants, a young man named Thomas, nodded, his eyes wide with fear. I tried to help him, Miss Marple. I don't know who did it. But he seemed to know something was coming. He kept muttering about the letter. Miss Marple's heart sank. It was worse than she had feared. Molesworth had been silenced, but not before he'd said enough to give her hope that the truth would still come to light. She knelt beside him, her hand steady as she checked his pulse and looked for any signs of life. "Molesworth," she said quietly, though she knew he could barely hear her. "What happened? Who did this to you?" His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment it seemed as if he might speak. But then, just as quickly, his face contorted in pain. His lips parted, but no words came. His hand reached toward her, trembling, as if trying to impart a final message. Miss Marple looked up, meeting Davy's gaze. He had arrived just in time to see Molesworth's futile struggle, his face pale with concern. "We need to get him inside," Miss Marple ordered. "He's not going to last long, but he might still have something to tell us." As they carefully lifted Molesworth and carried him back into the house, Miss Marple's mind raced. Who could have done this? And why? Was this a warning? Or was someone trying to erase all traces of the crime for good? Once inside, they laid Molesworth on the settee in the sitting room. His breathing was shallow now, his face ashen, but Miss Marple wasn't about to give up on him. She needed answers she couldn't afford to let slip away. She glanced at the rest of the room, making sure they were alone. Then, leaning closer to Molesworth's ear, she whispered softly, "Tell me who did this. Who shot you? Was it someone in this house?" His hand twitched, but he didn't respond. Miss Marple leaned in again, gently this time, almost tenderly, knowing this would be her last chance to learn the truth. But just as she was about to ask again, a new sound echoed through the house, a creak of wood, a faint thud. Miss Marple froze, her eyes darting to the door. Something was wrong. With a sudden burst of movement, Davies rushed toward the door, pushing it open with force. There, standing in the doorway, was Margaret Brackwell, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. In her hands she held a small blood-stained letter. "The letter," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't Molesworth. It wasn't him." She stepped inside, holding the letter out to Miss Marple. I found it in the garden. It was left there just moments ago. Someone else must have been trying to get rid of it." Miss Marple's heart lurched as she took the letter from Margaret, her hands trembling. The blood-stained paper was unmistakable, but there was something about it. Something about the way it was folded, its edges frayed, as if it had been hurriedly shoved into Margaret's hands. She glanced at Margaret, whose eyes flickered with a strange mix of fear and uncertainty. Before Miss Marple could respond, Molesworth's breath hitched one last time, and with a final gasp, he fell still. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The truth was slipping through her fingers, and the game was becoming more dangerous by the second. Molesworth was dead. The letter he had clung to was now in someone else's hands, and the trail was growing colder by the minute. But Miss Marple knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone in this house had just made their final, fatal mistake. The stakes had never been higher. And now, the race to uncover the truth had turned into a fight to prevent an even greater crime from unfolding before her eyes. The stillness in the room after Molesworth's passing was suffocating. Miss Marple, still holding the blood-stained letter in her hand, could barely focus on the soft murmur of voices in the background. The guests, who had been hastily gathered back into the sitting room, now stood frozen, waiting for some kind of direction. But Miss Marple wasn't thinking about them. Her mind was racing, chasing fragments of the puzzle she could almost see, but hadn't yet fully grasped. She glanced again at the letter, her fingers tracing the edges as if it might reveal more to her. The blood. Was it Molesworth's or someone else's? Margaret's hands had shaken as she passed it to her, but it was hard to tell if that was due to shock or guilt. The letter itself, folded carefully and stained in a way that made it seem almost deliberate, seemed to mock her. It was so close to the truth, yet so far out of reach. As the room quieted, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the conversation earlier in the evening, the one between Molesworth and Davies. She had overheard fragments, barely more than snippets, but something in Molesworth's tone had stuck with her. He had been talking about a pattern, about how everything led back to a single point. That point, Miss Marple knew now, was the letter. The one everyone had been chasing, the one that had apparently cost Molesworth his life. But then an offhand comment from Mrs. Hadley echoed through her mind. It had been lost in the noise at the time, but now it seemed important. "The letter, Mrs. Hadley?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice calm yet commanding. "Yes, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hadley answered, her voice trembling slightly. "When did you first notice it had gone missing?" Miss Marple pressed, her gaze steady. Mrs. Hadley blinked, taken off guard by the sudden question. "Well, I hadn't noticed it was gone until just after Mr. Molesworth was found, ma'am. I'm certain it was still there this morning. It was on the desk, next to the clock." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The desk, the clock. Both had been mentioned in passing by Margaret earlier, but it was a casual observation that hadn't struck Miss Marple as important at the time. Now it all clicked. The clock in Molesworth's study wasn't just a clock. It was a part of the larger picture. There was a pattern to everything. The hands on the clock had been frozen at exactly 9:15 when she had first entered the room. An odd detail she had noted but hadn't yet understood. 9:15. That had been when the argument between Molesworth and Margaret had escalated. The conflict seemed too trivial at the time, just a lover's quarrel of sorts. But it was more than that. It was the moment the clock stopped, and with it, everything had frozen in place. Miss Marple glanced at Margaret, whose face was a mask of fear and confusion, and suddenly everything clicked into place. She had been so fixated on the letter and the immediate aftermath that she had missed the significance of the clock and Molesworth's cryptic warning about patterns. Margaret's words had been a distraction, a deliberate attempt to draw attention away from the truth. It wasn't just about the letter, it was about timing. Molesworth had known something about the clock, and now she realized that someone had been using the timing to orchestrate the entire sequence of events. The letter, the clock, and the shooting, it all aligned in a way that had escaped Miss Marple's notice until now. "The clock," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "It's been telling us everything we need to know." Davies, who had been watching her intently, stepped forward. "What are you saying, Miss Marple?" "The clock in Molesworth's study," Miss Marple explained, her voice taking on a sharper tone. "It's been a marker, a silent signal." The hands stopped at 9:15, and that was the moment things began to unravel. Margaret shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the clock, her eyes darting around the room. "What does that have to do with the letter? With everything else?" she asked, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. "Everything," Miss Marple said firmly, her eyes locking with Margaret's. "It's not a coincidence. The letter was never the key. The real clue lies in the timing." As Miss Marple spoke, her mind raced back to that evening, to the small, seemingly insignificant details that hadn't fit together until now. The way Margaret had been acting, her unease about Molesworth's sudden interest in the letter, and how she had seemed to recoil when the clock had been mentioned earlier. It was all part of the same story. The gunshot, the letter, the desperate scramble to hide the truth. All of it was calculated. Someone had been pulling the strings, and they had carefully constructed this web of lies, weaving it in such a way that Miss Marple had been forced to follow the wrong trail. The letter had been a decoy, a red herring to distract her, while the true answer was hiding in plain sight, ticking away with every passing moment. Miss Marple turned to Margaret, her expression stern. "You've been manipulating the timing of events, haven't you? It wasn't Molesworth who was the real target. It was always you." Margaret's face blanched, and for a moment she looked as though she might collapse. Her hands clenched the edge of the chair, her knuckles white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. "You've been orchestrating this entire thing," Miss Marple continued, her voice cutting through the tension. "The letter, the attack on Molesworth, the timing of everything. It was all planned to lead us in circles while you buried the truth. You didn't want anyone to find out, did you?" Margaret's silence spoke volumes, confirming what Miss Marple had already suspected. The truth was now clear. The crime had been meticulously planned, and the real danger was far greater than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple stood, her mind already calculating the next steps. The web was unraveling, but there was still more to discover, more connections to be made. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Miss Marple knew that the clock had just begun to tick toward its final, most crucial moment. The room was thick with the weight of Miss Marple's revelation. Margaret, who had been standing so tall and composed moments earlier, now appeared small and fragile, her hands trembling at her sides. Miss Marple observed her closely, reading the subtle shifts in her expression, the brief flickers of fear and guilt. It wasn't just the pressure of the situation. Margaret had been caught in her own lie, and now her carefully crafted mask was beginning to crack. But Miss Marple wasn't looking for guilt or fear alone. She was searching for something more, something deeper. The puzzle was almost complete, but there was a piece missing, something that connected the dots in a way no one had considered. She could feel the lingering tension in the room, a palpable energy that seemed to pulse with the truth just out of reach. Miss Marple turned to Davies, whose expression mirrored the same confusion that had clouded his thoughts earlier. He was still processing the shift in their investigation, trying to make sense of what had just been uncovered. "Davies," Miss Marple said quietly, her eyes unwavering, "we've been chasing the wrong motive." "Wrong motive?" he echoed, furrowing his brow in disbelief. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "We've been looking for money, for power, for revenge, but none of those things explain the lengths to which Margaret has gone to conceal the truth." Margaret's lips tightened, but she didn't speak. Instead, she shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flickering nervously to the door as though she might flee, but knowing that would be futile. "It's not just about what Molesworth could offer you," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm, yet cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "It's about control, about fear, your fear of being exposed." Margaret's face drained of colour. For a moment she seemed paralyzed, unable to respond. The others in the room waited, hanging on every word. "You're right to be afraid," Miss Marple said, turning her gaze back to Margaret. "But you've misunderstood something important. You've been using the letter, the clock, and the evidence as a diversion. You thought that if you created enough confusion, no one would notice the true motive behind Molesworth's death. Davies stepped forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "You're saying it wasn't about Molesworth at all?" "No," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "It was about the power Molesworth had over Margaret. He didn't just want her to marry him, he wanted to control her. And when he threatened to reveal something far more intimate, something that would expose Margaret's deepest fears," she snapped. "It wasn't about money or status. It was about keeping a secret buried at all costs." Margaret's eyes widened, her lips quivering with panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the slightest movement, her shaking hands clenched into fists, her knuckles whitening. There was a sudden shift in the atmosphere, and Miss Marple saw the moment when Margaret's mind broke. "Tell us," Miss Marple pressed. "What is it that Molesworth knew? What was it you were so desperate to protect?" Margaret's eyes darted to the others in the room, as if measuring how much they would be able to understand. Her shoulders trembled under the weight of the truth she had kept hidden for so long. Finally, she let out a breath, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Molesworth knew about the affair," she said, her voice thick with shame. "But that's not the worst part. He knew that the child wasn't his. He was never supposed to find out. He wasn't supposed to be the one to raise a child that wasn't his own." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Miss Marple's sharp gaze flicked to Davies, whose face mirrored the shock in the room. The unspoken connection was clear now. Molesworth had learned the truth about the child, and he had used that knowledge as leverage. The stakes had been higher than anyone had imagined. Margaret had been living in fear for years, haunted by the knowledge that someone might one day expose her secret. The letter, the clock, the staged evidence. It had all been a desperate attempt to keep that truth buried. "But why kill Molesworth?" Davies asked, still struggling to grasp the full extent of the situation. "Because he had become too dangerous," Margaret's voice broke, the weight of the confession sinking in. "He was going to tell everyone. I couldn't let that happen. If people found out, it would ruin everything. I'd lose my life, my family, everything I've worked for." Her eyes filled with tears, but there was no remorse in them, only raw, unbridled fear. Fear of losing the control she had so carefully built, fear of facing the consequences of a secret too terrible to bear. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but she didn't offer any comfort. She didn't need to. The truth had already been laid bare. The motive wasn't about greed or jealousy. It was about fear. Fear of being exposed, of being seen for who Margaret truly was, and of losing the life she had fought so hard to protect. As the room fell into stunned silence, Miss Marple took a step back, her mind whirling with the implications. This wasn't just a case of murder. It was a tragedy of self-destruction. Margaret had been caught in her own web of deception, and now it was unraveling before her very eyes. Davies was the first to break the silence. "So, what happens now?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were still focused on Margaret, who had sunk into a chair, her hands clasped tightly together, her face buried in her palms. Miss Marple understood the true depth of the tragedy now. It wasn't just about what Margaret had done. It was about who she had become in the process. "Now," Miss Marple said, her voice steady, "we face the consequences." As the words settled into the room, a new sense of finality hung in the air. Margaret's fate had been sealed long before the crime had been committed. Her fear, her lies, had led her here. The truth had come to light, and with it, the heavy realization that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones the rain had started falling heavily, each drop a small hammering against the windows of the study, where Miss Marple, Davies, and the others gathered. Outside, the sky had turned a dark shade of grey, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final act to unfold. The tension in the room was palpable, each person aware that the investigation was nearing its end, but none of them quite prepared for how it would all come together. Margaret sat by the fire, her head bowed, a blanket of resignation weighing on her shoulders. She had spoken her truth, but something still gnawed at the edges of her admission, an undeniable sense that the case wasn't truly closed, not yet. Miss Marple, however, felt the opposite. The puzzle was all but solved, and she knew there was one last piece to place. Davies had gone over the evidence again, pacing in the corner, his mind racing through every inconsistency, every strange behavior, every question left unanswered. He had seen it before, the way criminals sometimes tried to rationalize their actions, even when the truth was staring them in the face. Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the rain, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. Her mind worked, slowly, deliberately, piecing together the final nuances of the case. Margaret's fear had led her to do terrible things, but the truth was always in her reach. The power she so desperately clung to was about to slip from her grasp. Yet something told Miss Marple that Margaret wasn't the only one hiding in the shadows. There was still someone else waiting. "Davies," Miss Marple said softly without turning. "You've overlooked something." He stopped pacing immediately. "What?" "The letter Molesworth was going to send before he died. It wasn't just a threat. It was an ultimatum." Her voice was steady, precise. Margaret wasn't the only one who had a motive to silence Molesworth. You've been focusing too much on her fear of exposure when there was someone else who had more to lose. Davies frowned, uncertainty flickering across his face. "You don't mean—" "Yes," Miss Marple interrupted, turning to face him. "I do. It's not just Margaret we need to be worried about. It's her husband, the quiet, patient man who's been standing in the background watching everything unfold." The room seemed to freeze as the realization hit. Margaret's husband, Arthur. He had never been questioned as thoroughly as the others. His alibi had seemed airtight, his demeanor calm, even comforting. He had given no reason for suspicion, yet Miss Marple now saw him clearly. Arthur had everything to lose if Molesworth's secret got out. He was the one who would be utterly ruined by the truth of the child that was not his own. It wasn't just the affair. It was the identity of the child's father. He had far more to fear than Margaret. "Arthur," Davies muttered, his face darkening as the implications sank in. "But why? Why would he kill Molesworth?" Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice lowered. "Because he had to. Margaret was desperate, yes, but Arthur had far more to lose. Molesworth was going to expose not just Margaret's secret, but his as well." As if on cue, the door creaked open, and Arthur stepped into the room, his face unusually pale. His eyes flickered from Margaret to Miss Marple, then to Davies. There was no escape now. He knew it. His carefully constructed facade of innocence had cracked under the weight of the truth. "I should have known," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself. "The way you were always so composed, so calm, too calm, in fact. You knew about—" Molesworth's letter. You were afraid it would come to light, weren't you? Arthur didn't reply at first, his lips pressed into a tight line, his eyes narrowing. But Miss Marple could see the smallest tremor in his hands, the flicker of panic in his eyes. He hadn't expected to be discovered this quickly. He thought he still had control, but the control had slipped from his grasp. I didn't want this, Arthur said finally, his voice low and strained. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But Molesworth left me no choice. He knew too much, and he was going to ruin everything. I couldn't let him destroy my family. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Your family, yes. But at what cost? She looked at him with quiet understanding, but also with the certainty that came from years of watching people lie, deceive, and justify their actions. You killed Molesworth to protect your reputation, to keep the truth buried. But the truth always comes out, doesn't it? Arthur's eyes flashed with frustration. You don't understand. Molesworth was a threat. He was going to expose us. My wife. She couldn't live with the shame, and neither could I. I had to do what I did. The words hung in the air, like a confession that had been years in the making. But there was still something more, something Miss Marple could feel but couldn't quite place. Arthur took a step back, his hand reaching for his coat pocket. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed instinctively, a signal to Davies, who immediately stepped closer. It was a split-second reaction, but it was enough. Before Arthur could pull out whatever it was he intended, Davies had grabbed his arm, stopping him cold. Not this time, Davies said firmly. Arthur's face twisted with anger, but there was no fight left in him. His shoulders slumped, his defenses shattered. I'm sorry, he muttered, his voice hoarse. I didn't want any of this. But I couldn't live in fear anymore. Molesworth had to die. Miss Marple watched the man crumble, understanding the complexity of his motives, fear, desperation, and the overwhelming need to protect his own secrets. But it wasn't enough to save him. It never was. The detective had set the perfect trap, and Arthur had walked right into it. With one final, decisive act, Miss Marple had brought the case to its resolution. Arthur was no longer in control. He was just another man trapped by his own fear and guilt, facing the consequences of his actions. The truth had emerged, and with it, the unsettling realization that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones we bury deep within ourselves, we keep from ourselves. The room remained eerily silent after Arthur's confession. The rain's relentless rhythm against the window seemed to echo the finality of the moment. Davies stood over him, hands firmly clasped behind his back, ensuring there would be no escape. Margaret had slumped in her chair, her face pale, eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and regret. Everything was falling into place as Miss Marple had expected. The pieces of the puzzle had been carefully put together, and the mystery was on the verge of being sealed. But there was something Miss Marple couldn't shake, an unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach that all of this, the resolution, the confessions, everything, was too easy. As she stood there, her gaze drifting from Arthur's crushed expression to the window, something gnawed at her mind. She couldn't put her finger on it. There was one last piece missing, something that had been lurking in the background all along, barely noticeable until now. Arthur, broken and defeated, sat quietly in the chair, his eyes no longer filled with the fire of defiance, but with a hollow resignation. He had thought his confession would be enough, that the case would be closed with his admission. He had underestimated Miss Marple. She stepped toward him, her shoes making soft taps on the wooden floor, as her mind churned over the details that had seemed to settle so neatly into place. She paused in front of him, observing the way his eyes flitted toward the door as though he were waiting for something. A final act, perhaps. A closing of the curtain. But then the smallest of gestures caught her eye. It was the faintest twitch of his hand, the way it shifted against his leg, almost imperceptible, like a slip in an otherwise composed demeanour. Miss Marple's sharp gaze honed in on it, and, with it, the smallest seed of doubt began to sprout in her mind. She couldn't ignore it. Not now. "You're not the only one involved in this, are you, Arthur?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an edge of authority that cut through the still air. "You've been protecting someone, haven't you?" Arthur froze, his face momentarily blank before he composed himself. He knew exactly what she meant. His eyes darted briefly toward Margaret, then quickly away, but Miss Marple saw it, the guilt and the knowledge in his eyes. "I don't know what you mean," Arthur said, his voice wavering. Miss Marple stood taller, her hands clasped before her, as if to steady herself for the inevitable unravelling. "The way you've been so eager to confess, yet you leave out the most important part. The one thing that makes this all make sense. You weren't acting alone, Arthur. There's someone else you've been protecting." The room fell into a tense silence. Margaret looked up now, her eyes wide with panic. "No, that's impossible. Arthur wouldn't." But Miss Marple raised a hand to silence her. "You knew all along, didn't you? You knew Arthur was involved. But there's more to it. I'd like to know who else is part of this little scheme of yours." Arthur's face twisted, his jaw clenched tight, and Miss Marple could see the struggle inside him. But she knew he couldn't hold out much longer. He was caught between his loyalty to the true mastermind and his desperation to keep everything from unravelling. A sudden knock on the door interrupted the tension, so perfectly timed that it could have been planned. Miss Marple turned to face the sound, and Davies moved to answer it, his eyes scanning the room as he opened the door to reveal a stranger standing on the threshold. The man was tall, with greying hair, a sharply tailored coat, and an air of confidence that suggested he knew far more than he should. "Good evening, Miss Marple," the man said, his tone smooth, his eyes fixed on her. "I believe I've arrived just in time." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to Arthur, then back to the man in the doorway. She wasn't surprised, but the realization hit with the sharpness of a well-placed dart. The last piece of the puzzle had arrived, and with it, the truth of who had been pulling the strings all along. "David Hargrove," Miss Marple said quietly, the recognition settling into her voice. "I should have known it would be you." Arthur's face drained of colour, and Margaret let out a strangled gasp. Hargrove was the last person any of them had expected to be involved in this sordid mess. As the local lawyer, Hargrove had seemed like a man with nothing to hide, but the truth, as it often did, had slithered into the shadows, revealing a far darker motive than anyone had realized. Hargrove stepped into the room, his eyes scanning each face before resting on Arthur's. "I must admit," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "you've done a wonderful job of keeping things under control, but Miss Marple has a way of poking around where she shouldn't." Arthur's expression twisted with a mix of anger and fear. "You," he muttered, shaking his head. "I tried. I didn't want anyone else to get hurt. But you made me do it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. You didn't just protect your own reputation, Arthur. You were protecting something far more important, Hargrove's secret. David Hargrove smiled faintly, stepping forward as if he had been expecting this moment. You see, Arthur and I have been partners in this little arrangement for quite some time. The money, the affairs, the lies, everything was a means to an end. We both had something to gain by keeping Margaret's secret hidden. But when Molesworth got too close to the truth, well, we had to act quickly. Margaret was shaking now, the truth unfolding in front of her, too horrified to speak. She had trusted Hargrove, believed in his honesty, in his position of authority. But it had all been a carefully constructed lie. He had been using her, using Arthur, all along. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her eyes cold with clarity. The money wasn't the only thing you stood to gain, was it, Hargrove? You had a far more personal interest in keeping things quiet. Molesworth wasn't just going to ruin Arthur's reputation. He was going to expose you too. Your relationship with Margaret, it wasn't just professional, was it? The room went deathly still. Margaret's eyes widened in realization, her breath catching in her throat. No, she whispered, barely able to comprehend the depth of the betrayal. Hargrove's smile faded, and for the first time his composure cracked. You really are a sharp one, Miss Marple, he said, his voice darkening. But you're too late. It's all over now. The final revelation had hit, a twist none of them had expected, and yet Miss Marple was already steps ahead. The game was no longer about solving the crime. It was about who would make the next move. The room was still, the air thick with tension, as the truth finally settled around them like a heavy shroud. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, unwavering, as David Hargrove stood there, his facade of confidence crumbling before her eyes. Arthur, now fully exposed, slumped in his chair, his hands trembling as he grasped for any shred of dignity left. Margaret, too, seemed caught between disbelief and devastation, her mind reeling from the revelation that the man she had trusted had betrayed her in the most intimate of ways. Hargrove's smile had faltered, but he was still trying to maintain control. He wasn't a man used to being outwitted, and the anger in his eyes burned with the knowledge that everything he had worked for was about to unravel. You think you've won, don't you? Hargrove sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. But you're too late. There's nothing left to expose. There's no one left to stop me. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. Her voice was calm, measured, as if she were simply explaining a well-known fact. No, Mr. Hargrove. You're mistaken. You've already lost. It's not about the money or the power. It's about the truth. And the truth, as always, has a way of coming to light. Arthur flinched at her words, his hands falling into his lap as if the weight of everything had finally settled on his shoulders. The guilt, the shame. He knew what he had done. He had been complicit in the deception, in the murder. But now, he could see it clearly. There was no escaping it. Hargrove's eyes darted between the faces in the room, his mind clearly racing. The door was still open behind him, the possibility of escape lingering in the air, and yet something kept him rooted in place, as if Miss Marple's steady composure was a force he could not ignore. He finally scoffed and straightened his posture. You think you can stop me? The police won't believe you. They'll never trace this back to me, not in time. Miss Marple shook her head slowly, a small, knowing smile curling at the corners of her lips. The police, Mr. Hargrove, don't need to believe me. They just need the evidence. The real question is, do you think your little game will hold up under scrutiny? With a slight tilt of her head, Miss Marple looked toward the door, where Sergeant Davies had silently slipped out during the brief exchange. The detective had known this moment was coming, had anticipated Hargrove's arrogance, and had set the trap accordingly. The rest of the evidence that Hargrove thought was buried, the financial records, the correspondence with Arthur, the documents that tied him directly to the murder, were now in the hands of the police. Hargrove's face twisted into a snarl. You think this is over? You don't know who you're dealing with. I still have friends in high places. I will get away with this. Before he could continue, a soft voice interrupted, cutting through the rising tension. I'm afraid that's not going to happen, Mr. Hargrove. The door creaked open, and Sergeant Davies re-entered the room, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. They moved with purpose, their eyes trained on Hargrove as if they already knew the outcome of this scene. You're under arrest for the murder of Edmund Molesworth, one of the officers said, his tone firm, and for conspiracy, fraud, and the attempted manipulation of several legal proceedings. Hargrove's eyes narrowed as his fate was sealed, the room closing in around him. He took a step backward, his bravado failing him for the first time. You can't, he began, but the words faltered in his throat. Miss Marple looked at him with pity, a faint flicker of regret in her expression. You had your chance, Mr. Hargrove. You could have walked away from all of this, but your pride and your greed got the better of you. That's what happens when you underestimate the truth. Hargrove didn't say another word. He was too far gone. The truth had caught up with him, and there would be no escape this time. As the officers moved to restrain him, Hargrove's eyes shot to Arthur, and for a moment Miss Marple saw something flicker in his gaze, something darker, a final spark of defiance. He wasn't entirely defeated yet, not in his mind. Arthur, however, was not looking at Hargrove. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his face pale and full of the realization of what he had allowed to happen. He had been a pawn in Hargrove's game, but he had made his own choices, and now it was too late for regrets. Take him away, Miss Marple said, turning toward the door as the officers led Hargrove away, his resistance futile in the face of the evidence. She paused at the doorway, turning back to Arthur and Margaret. I would suggest, Arthur, that you take responsibility for your actions. The police will need your cooperation, but perhaps in the end you'll find a way to make things right. As for you, Margaret, Miss Marple's voice softened. You've been hurt by those you trusted most. It will take time to heal, but you'll find your way. Don't let this define you. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes red-rimmed but steady now. There was no more hiding, no more lies. The truth had emerged, and while it hadn't been kind, it had been necessary. As the police took Hargrove away, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied sigh. The pieces had fallen into place, and the twisted web of lies had been unravelled. The case was, in many ways, closed. But there was a lingering question, something that tugged at the back of her mind. She walked over to the window, her gaze drifting over the estate one last time. The rain had stopped, and the dark clouds had parted, leaving the first light of dawn to filter through. It was over. The villains had been caught, the truth revealed. Yet as she stood there, she couldn't help but wonder, had they truly escaped the shadows of their past? Or was this just the beginning of something deeper, something darker yet to unfold? With one final glance, Miss Marple turned away. the satisfaction of a case well solved, mingling with the quiet, unease of knowing that in the end justice was never as simple as it seemed. The crisp morning air cut through the silence as Miss Marple made her way down the long, winding driveway. The weight of the case still hung heavily around her shoulders, though she had seen it to its rightful end. The sun, finally breaking free of the clouds, bathed the sprawling estate in a soft golden light. But there was no peace in it for her. The rain had stopped, but the damp scent of the earth seemed to linger in the air, reminding her of the days spent in shadow, piecing together secrets that no one else had noticed. As the officers drove away with Hargrove, his arrest marking the final chapter of a long and convoluted investigation, Miss Marple paused for a moment to watch the retreating vehicle. Her mind, sharp as ever, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, that a loose end was still trailing behind, unseen by most. She felt it tug at her, an invisible thread just waiting to unravel. The case had been a labyrinth, twists, turns and hidden motives all wrapped around a single, tragic death. And yet, even with Hargrove in custody, even with the financial documents laid bare and the damning evidence that connected him to the crime, Miss Marple couldn't ignore the subtle dissonance that still echoed in the corners of her mind. She turned toward the house, where Margaret stood on the porch looking out at the retreating car. The young woman had come a long way from the frightened, naive girl Miss Marple had first met. In the wake of the revelations, Margaret's expression was one of quiet contemplation, no longer plagued by confusion, but also not yet free from the heavy burden of betrayal that had crushed her world. Miss Marple approached her, her steps deliberate but gentle. "Margaret," she said softly, "I know this hasn't been easy, but you'll find a way through it. People like Hargrove, people who live in shadows, always leave a trace behind, and that's what makes them vulnerable in the end." Margaret nodded, her lips trembling as she fought to maintain her composure. "I'm trying to understand it all," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I still don't understand why. Why did he do it? Why did Arthur get involved?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Sometimes, Margaret, the reasons don't come as easily as we'd like. Greed, ambition, a thirst for power. All those things cloud a person's judgment until they don't even recognize themselves anymore, but I think there was something else at play here, something deeper." Margaret's gaze shifted to the horizon, as though she were trying to find meaning in the landscape. But the weight of her grief seemed to anchor her, pulling her gaze back to the ground. Miss Marple followed her eyes, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was a quiet understanding between them. Margaret had lost so much, and while justice had been served, it had come at too high a cost. "Miss Marple, do you think that's the end of it?" Margaret asked hesitantly, her voice cracking. The detective remained silent for a moment longer, studying the young woman with the keen insight that had led her to this very conclusion. "I think we're never truly finished with a case, Margaret. Not until everything is laid bare. But for now, perhaps it's best if you allow yourself some time to heal, to start fresh. The world will keep turning." Margaret's gaze met Miss Marple's, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. She opened her mouth as if to say something more, but paused, lost in the storm of her emotions. Miss Marple nodded at last, offering a final smile before turning her attention back to the car that was now a small speck in the distance. As it faded, she glanced over her shoulder at the house, her sharp instincts picking up on something that remained hidden just beneath the surface of this case. There was something about that final confrontation, something in the way Hargrove had reacted. His fear had been palpable, yes, but there was also a flicker of something else, something more insidious. It wasn't just his rage that had been calculated, but the way he had tried to sow doubt, the way he had spoken of friends in high places. Hargrove, as shrewd and calculating as he was, had not played the game alone. And somewhere, in the wake of his fall, there was the faintest scent of something still burning, something that hadn't yet been extinguished. The wheels in Miss Marple's mind turned. She had trusted the evidence, trusted the people she had spoken to, but the nagging feeling hadn't abated. It was almost as though the case had been too perfectly tied up. Was it possible that something crucial had been overlooked? Or had the real mastermind, the true architect of the entire scheme, slipped through their fingers, content with letting Hargrove take the fall while the shadowy figure remained hidden in the background? She took a step forward, her thoughts sharp and focused. In her line of work, she had learned not to trust appearances. Every case had its dark corners, those places where truth hid in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. Even as the sun rose higher in the sky, Miss Marple's mind turned toward the next puzzle, the one that had yet to reveal itself, the one she was already seeing through the gaps in the story she had just unraveled. Turning back to Margaret, she gave her one last look. Take care of yourself, Margaret. The future may be uncertain, but you will find your path. Remember that. As Miss Marple walked away, her steps growing slower as she reflected on the complexity of the case, a small, cryptic detail lingered in her mind. It was something Edmund Molesworth had said, something so seemingly insignificant at the time. A passing comment made while they were going over his records, a fleeting observation about a certain business contact of Hargrove's, someone who had been absent during the investigation. Her steps quickened, the puzzle pieces clicking into place one by one. Perhaps the real mastermind hadn't been in the house at all. Maybe he was out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The case had not ended. Not yet. And as Miss Marple continued down the path, the sun shining brightly above her, she knew one thing for certain: this mystery, like so many others, would never truly be solved. Not as long as there were still questions, as long as there were still those who thought they could outwit her. The game was never really over, and the next case was already waiting.